Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate 2906, which is at the desk, that the bill be read a third time and passed, and the motion to be reconsidered be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam President,
Senator from North Carolina.
Reserving the right to object. I want to just thank my friend, Senator Manchin. He and I serve on the VA committee. I know he's absolutely committed to trying to do the best that we possibly can for our veterans. We may have a disagreement on what he has in mind for this particular UC, but I don't think there's any daylight between us in terms of what we're trying to do for veterans, and I look forward to working with the chair on getting to a good place and to address, in the setting of the committee, some of the concerns that he has. For that reason, I object.
Madam President.
Objection is heard. Objection is heard.
I'd like the right to proceed, if I may. First of all, I want to thank my good friend from North Carolina, Senator Tillis, always willing to work in a bipartisan way, and I appreciate it very much because we have very much concerns about the VA and all our veterans. You're in a state that has a tremendous population, and I have a state that has a tremendous population of veterans. Madam President, I'm disappointed that there was an objection to my bill. I rise today to speak to my frustration that the Asset and Infrastructure Review, or the so-called AIR Act provision, is being included in what is otherwise a very good package. I want to thank Chairman Isaacson, Ranking Member Tester, Senator Tillis, for all their hard work on the overall Mission Act. The Mission Act is going to do so many good things. It's going to streamline how we provide non-VA care. It is finally expanding caregivers for veterans of all eras, and it will make it easier for the VA to hire high-quality providers. But I'm against adding the AIR, which is the Asset and Infrastructure Review Act, or as I like to call it, the VA BRAC, into this bill because it could be detrimental to rural veterans. The AIR Act provision was supposedly added by House Republicans to the Mission Act because the Senate insisted that caregivers bill be included. I am a proud co-sponsor of the caregivers bill because it does not make sense to give a benefit to one era of veterans and not give it to them all. Now, I want to thank my colleague, Senator Murray, for the years she has dedicated to the caregivers issue. The AIR Act was never voted on or discussed in the Senate Veterans Committee. It was never, ever voted on or discussed in the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. The House Caregivers Companion Bill is bipartisan and has 90 co-sponsors. We could pass this bill without the AIR Act in a heartbeat. While I am generally supportive of efforts to cut waste, the AIR Act will not come close to paying for the bill. Instead, it puts rural hospitals and facilities like those in West Virginia in the crosshairs of the VA bureaucrats and technocrats who do not know my veterans and what they need. The last time there was an asset review, the CARES Commission, was in the early 2000s. It recommended closing the acute inpatient hospital beds and contracting for acute care in the community for the Beckley VA Medical Center. Only after stakeholders yelled and screamed did the Secretary not follow their recommendations. Today, those 25 acute care beds and 5 ICU beds are vitally important, not just to our Southern West Virginia veteran community, but the entire community. Administrators at the surrounding hospitals have told me that they could not absorb the Beckley VA patients' load. We are lucky then to have vocal stakeholders holler and scream and a secretary who listen, but we'll be so lucky in the future. Furthermore, should veterans have to endure the uncertainty that their VA, hospital, or CBOC may not always be there for them. My veteran population is nearly 40% Vietnam veterans. In the last 10 years, there was a nearly 20% decrease in my veteran population because my World War II and Korea veterans are dying and my Vietnam veterans are not getting any younger. If we send in this commission in and they do the analysis, my fear is that resources and funding will be realigned away from our patriotic West Virginia veterans. Phoenix gets picked over Clarksburg, Los Angeles over Beckley, Washington, D.C. over Martinsburg, and Orlando over Huntington. I feel sure the VA will follow the law, hold their public hearings, and read statements put in the Federal Register, but they'll still have the power to close or downsize West Virginia facilities. Just because you are a veteran living in a rural area does not mean you don't deserve the same quality and access of care that you would receive in an urban area. Is this truly about taking evaluation of waste, or is this the slow filing away of the VA infrastructure as we know it? I'm sure that the Mission Act just passed out of the House 347 to 70, and I have a lot of good friends on both sides of the aisle who want the overall bill. It has the support of the National Veterans Service organizations, and the effects of this bill will not likely come into being until 2025, and I will not be serving in the Senate then. Yet, for the sake of the veteran population in West Virginia, I have to say something publicly. The AIR Act could have detrimental second and third order effects in our communities. If this bill passes with the AIR Act in it, the powers that wish to downsize the level of care that we give to veterans will see it as a victory. But they should be prepared for robust, exhaustive oversight by me and my colleagues on the committee. If we don't have the market assessments, access to other population data, and if the central office doesn't start filling some of the healthcare provider vacancies in West Virginia VA medical centers, I will reluctantly put a hold on some nominees for this commission. I'm going to encourage my colleagues from rural states that represent rural areas to do the same. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President. There's a million reasons why I love North Carolina, but one of them is that it's a state of 10 million people. About half those people live in urban areas, and the other half live in rural areas. It's also a state that 1 in 10 people in the state are veterans, and it also is the state that proudly claims being one of the fastest growing veterans populations in the country. So when I go into the VA committee and I look at what we've got to do, I don't look at it as coming from an urban state. I don't look at it as coming from a rural state. In many respects, I think that North Carolina is a microcosm of the nation as a whole. And so when we look at some of the changes that we want to make, what I hope we get out of this review is what do we do with the 430 empty buildings, many of them as much as 90 years old, that are owned by the VA. And we may have to do basic maintenance on them, but they're properties that may have a historic value. Maybe we can convey them to the states or sell them and use those resources to plow back in to quality care for the veterans. So I can tell my friend from West Virginia that we share a mountain range together. We share a lot of cultures out in the western part of our state and in West Virginia. And there's no way on earth that I would allow the VA to move forward on something that I felt like was going further away from providing quality care to any veteran anywhere in West Virginia, North Carolina, or any other rural area. I do believe, though, that on the one hand, we continue to say we don't have enough mudding for veteran. On the other hand, we say that we've got to find some of those additional resources by taking steps to make the VA more efficient, shed the assets that are no longer providing value to the veterans, and I, for one, believe that we can do it on a balanced basis. But as this process goes through, it's actually an authority that the VA has today. They haven't acted on it. We're trying to put more pressure on them, making some concise decisions. The gentleman from West Virginia has my commitment that any instance where we see a decision being made by the VA is something that's going to take veterans further away from care, then I'll be the first one to join them in making sure that we don't allow that to happen. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President, if I can just respond to my
Senator
colleague,
from West Virginia.
I agree with my colleague from North Carolina. We don't want to continue if there's areas and assets that can be done away with for efficiencies. I understand that that can be done without this. The AIR Act, I don't know the underlying reasons for it, but the AIR Act was never even discussed in our committee. We never had the bill in front of us at all. And that's all I was saying, well, how all of a sudden did this get thrown in? And I understand because of what we put in, the expansion of how we were going to take care of caregivers to all populations of veterans, that they were upset on the House side, Senator, and this was put in retribution to that. I just objected to how it was put in, what the intent was. I believe the VA can dispose of excess properties that have been closed, vacant, not in utilization. I'm concerned that they're going to come back and say, okay, in a rural area, we're going to close this C-box or this veteran, we're going to consolidate, and we have more and more need right now and a greater need with some of our population base, especially with what we have going conflicts around the world now. And I've never talked to a veteran that did not want veteran care. If there was any way they could get to a veterans hospital or a clinic, that was the people that knew them best, knew how to take care of their concerns. And that's all I'm trying to preserve. And I don't know what the intentions are of this, and that's why I wanted to have that removed. And then we can discuss it in our Senate VA committee and maybe make a better way of reviewing the excess properties and the properties not being utilized. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.